The world's economic systems have evolved through different phases, each marked by crisis, reform, and shifting ideologies, from the rigid constraints of the gold standard to the rise and subsequent challenges of neoliberalism. These transformations reveal fundamental tensions between global economic integration, political sovereignty, and social equity. In this episode of the Intrinsic Report, I'll be exploring these shifts and highlighting the key events, figures, and systems that have shaped today's global economic landscape. If you're looking to investigate the undercurrents driving the ongoing trade war, I'm excited to have you tag along for the journey. Before I forget, I'm your host, Martin K.
Will China totally replace the US as the sole superpower? Or will the 21st century be the age of multipolarity? Could China perhaps implode from within, completely thwarting its global ambitions altogether? The answers to all these questions lie in studying the cycles in China's 5,000-year history. This episode is brought to you by 11 Reader. 11 Reader turns ebooks into audio so that you can easily listen to them on the go. The best part about 11 Reader is that you can clone your voice and use it to read your audiobooks or even bedtime stories to your kids in your voice. Check out 11 Reader down in the description.
As early as 1717, Isaac Newton, as master of mint, set a fixed ratio between gold and silver, undervaluing silver, leading Britain toward a de facto gold standard. Although officially bimetallic, Britain increasingly favored gold and, by the mid 18th century, operated in practice as a gold based economy. The Napoleonic Wars disrupted this order. In 1797, Britain was forced to suspend gold convertibility under the Bank Restriction Act, issuing unbacked paper currency to finance the war effort. The result? Inflation, depreciation, and contentious debates about the nature of money. By 1821, convertibility was formally restored. This time, the gold standard was legal and deliberate, a move intended to restore credibility and price stability in a post war industrializing economy. Britain's leadership in finance and trade led others to emulate this model. By the 1870s, the classical gold standard emerged as a global system. Countries like Germany, France, US, and Japan pegged their currencies to gold, establishing fixed exchange rates, which in turn fostered international trade and capital flows. Central banks managed reserves and gold convertibility, while relative geopolitical calm under the Pax Britannica helped the system flourish. This arrangement resulted in high investor confidence and low inflation. Yet, this harmony was fragile. Countries had to prioritize maintaining gold reserves over domestic needs like employment or social welfare. As a result, political instability often emerged. World War I would be the undoing of the gold standard. Nations suspended convertibility to fund the war, triggering inflation and currency dislocation. Though brief attempts were made to restore the gold standard during the interwar years, most notably by Britain in 1925, these efforts faltered. For starters, the US had in place rigid monetary policies to protect itself from the economic fallout of war in Europe. This, coupled with Germany's hyperinflation and the deflationary pressures of maintaining pre-war exchange rates worsened the Great Depression. So eventually, like most nations already had, Britain succumbed to abandoning gold entirely. We're going to take a step back just to make sure that we are tracking what's going on. Now, the first experiment in global economic integration, it wasn't exactly calculated in the sense of the word, although on paper it looked airtight. You had convertibility to gold, free trade, high investor confidence, low inflation. As far as the eye could see, it was perfect. But over time, domestic pressures like social unrests and wars put the system to the test. And in the end, when countries were forced to choose between upholding a distant global order or protecting their own sovereignty and economic well being, they kind of always chose the latter. That, in a sense, helps us to frame exactly what is going on with the current tariff beef trade war, because that essentially is a conversation that's going on here. What matters more? In the wake of World War II, the Bretton Woods Agreement created a new global monetary system. Currencies were pegged to the US dollar, which was in turn convertible to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. Therefore, the US would bear the cost of being the only country in the world that was strictly limited to the classical gold standard, while everyone else enjoyed limited flexibility in exchange rates, giving these countries more freedom to pursue domestic policies. And just thinking about it now, if this wasn't a setup, Americans do have a big heart. Key international institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were established to manage global financial stability and facilitate economic development. However, as Europe and Japan recovered post war, their economies grew stronger, making the Bretton Woods system's reliance on the US dollar increasingly unsustainable. First, from the American perspective, the dollar gold system facilitated post war reconstruction and economic growth abroad at the expense of the domestic. Also, by the 1960s, the US trade deficits and global demand for dollars outpaced American gold reserves. These economic sentiments would set up the Nixon Shock. So in 1971, President Nixon ended dollar convertibility, effectively dismantling Bretton Woods and ushering in a new era of fiat currencies and floating exchange rates. Look, I get why President Nixon takes heat for ending the Bretton Woods system, but honestly, what would you have done different in his position? The US was locked into a rigid gold standard that was dragging down the domestic economy, while peer nations over here were gaining ground with more flexible floating exchange rates. At some point, jumping ship wasn't just practical, it was inevitable. So President Nixon has taken the US off the gold standard. That ends the fixed exchange rate system and ushers in an era of floating currencies and increased market volatility. The immediate consequences stagflation. This was particularly in the 1970s, which undermined the assumptions of Keynesian economics that government intervention is necessary to manage demand and smooth economic cycles. At this point, a new economic ideology began to take root, neoliberalism. Advocated by the likes of Milton Friedman, Frederick Hayek, and James Buchanan, neoliberalism called for reduced government intervention, deregulation of markets, privatization of state assets, and the expansion of free markets. Then US President Ronald Reagan and UK Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher implemented these policies during the 80s. Thatcher privatized state-owned industries like the British Rail and reduced union powers, while Reagan slashed taxes and promoted a deregulated financial environment. Neoliberalism found fertile ground in global institutions like the IMF and the World Trade Organization, which imposed market-oriented policies on developing countries. However, neoliberalism's rise was not without criticism, as financial markets were deregulated, inequalities grew, wages stagnated, and global economic crises became frequent. And the neoliberal mantra that markets would self-correct was exposed as flawed. So President Nixon has taken the US off the gold standard. In the wake of this global financial crisis, there was need for some stability, and the US dollar emerged as the linchpin of global trade and finance. This was through a system known as the Minotaur, where the US effectively became the global consumer engine, absorbing capital surpluses from other countries such as China, Japan, and oil-rich nations. These countries exported goods and capital to the US, and in return, the US customers fueled global demand. Wall Street became the vehicle for absorbing these capital flows, leading to rising debt and speculative bubbles. This system allowed the US to dominate global economy without formal leadership, relying on persistent trade deficits and debt to maintain global liquidity. This asymmetrical system proved unsustainable. By the mid 2000s, the US faced growing inflation and dwindling gold reserves, causing a decline in the confidence of the US dollar. So the 2008 financial crisis was a major shock, revealing the fragility of the global financial system, which had been built on unregulated financial markets and the dominance of the dollar. The response: bank bailouts, austerity measures, and central bank interventions. All of these a contribution of the neoliberal approach, further cementing the power of financial elites. We've come a long way from a global financial order anchored in gold convertibility to one driven by floating exchange rates, ideology, and institutions. With each transition from the classical gold standards to the Bretton Woods system to today's fiat based system, there's always been a sense of confidence that the new would fix the flaws of the old. Yet, time and time again, no matter how polished the design, every system eventually frays at the local level. The failure of the neoliberal economic order became apparent after the 2008 financial crash, which vindicated the long-standing concerns and criticisms of deregulation and financialization. The crisis sparked the rise of populism and economic nationalism, with countries increasingly questioning the benefits of open markets. In the United States, anger at Wall Street bailouts and the perceived abandonment of the working and middle classes helped fuel the support for anti establishment figures like Donald Trump, who campaigned on the platform of economic nationalism, protectionism, and American first rhetoric. The EU's response to the crisis, especially the imposition of austerity measures on countries like Greece, led to deepening inequality and economic stagnation. In Britain, the economic insecurity that followed the crash contributed to public disenchantment with globalization and the EU, culminating in the Brexit referendum. The Leave campaign's emphasis on taking back control resonated strongly, in post-industrial regions hit hard by deindustrialization, reflecting a broader desire for economic sovereignty. In the aftermath of the crisis, many developing countries are questioning the neoliberal model imposed by international institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and World Trade Organization, which have often prioritized free markets and deregulation over social protections and economic sovereignty. China's economic rise, which was achieved through state guided capitalism, stands in contrast to the neoliberal framework. Unlike countries forced to adopt neoliberal policies by the IMF and the World Bank, China selectively embraced market reforms while maintaining strong state control over key sectors. This strategy has allowed China to become a global economic powerhouse without fully submitting to market forces. I hate to say this, but if China's model is the right way to do it, it does make it seem like the globalization that has defined the past few decades has been a losing formula of putting ideology over practicability. The world's economic systems have undergone significant transformation over the last century, from the rigid gold standard to the flexible, volatile post-Bretton Woods system, and finally to the neoliberal model that dominated the late 20th century and early 21st centuries. These transformations reveal fundamental tensions between systems of global economic integration, political sovereignty, and social equity. Depending on who you ask, the raging debate over the ongoing tariffs, beef, trade wars, I don't know what they're calling it actually, boils down to two distinct domestic priorities. For some, it's about managing the cost of living. For others, it's about reviving American manufacturing, particularly in regions that have seen decades of industrial decline. These are both reasonable aspirations as far as I can tell. Yet, the media is often framing the debate as an either or scenario. Donald Trump, on the other hand, characteristically bold, claims that he can deliver both. We'll just have to see how that one pans out. I don't claim to have all the answers, but after a little bit of digging, the underlying mechanics start to reveal themselves. See, for most countries, tariffs are tools of domestic policy deployed strategically to protect key industries, stimulate targeted growth, or respond to economic shocks. In other words, they are used in the service of the national interests, prioritizing domestic stability over global harmonization. But in the case of the United States, past administrations have often approached tariffs not as economic instruments, but as diplomatic levers used to further foreign policy objectives, even when at the expense of domestic industry and labor. Donald Trump ran on undoing it. So here we are. We're definitely at the cusp of something major. I'm not quite sure how I feel about all of this. However, as a history buff, it's a great time to be alive. I'll tell you that. Well, thank you for staying all the way through till the end. I appreciate your company. As always, I look forward to hearing from you and getting to know what your thoughts are on the biggest headlines of the week and whether you thought me putting it in its historical context was helpful to you. Give the video a like if you got any value out of it. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel for more. I've been your host, Martin K. As always, a pleasure. We'll see you in the next one. Take care. Bye bye.